The bullet shattered the window of the general store 3 inches from Marianne Hollis's head, and she knew immediately it was meant as a warning rather than a true attempt on her life. She dropped behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs as shards of glass rained down onto the wooden floorboards. Her hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the cool planks, breathing hard through her nose while the acrid smell of gunpowder drifted through the broken window. This was the 3rd time this month someone had tried to drive her out of Gonzales, Texas, and it was only 1878, a year that had started with such promise but had quickly dissolved into a nightmare of whispers, threats, and now gunfire. She stayed low for several minutes, listening to the sounds of boots running away down the dusty main street, followed by the inevitable silence that always came after these incidents. Nobody would help. Nobody would come running to see if she was hurt. That was what happened when you were half Mexican and half white in a town that had decided you belonged to neither world. Her mother had been a beautiful woman from Monterey who had fallen in love with her father, a Texas rancher, during one of his cattle drives south. They had married despite the protests from both families, and for a while they had been happy on their small ranch outside town. Then the fever had taken her mother when Marianne was only 12, and her father had followed 3 years later from a riding accident that everyone whispered might not have been an accident at all. At 22, Marianne had inherited the ranch and her father's debts, which meant she had been forced to sell most of the land and move into town where she worked at the general store owned by Mr. Peterson, one of the few people who would employ her. She lived in a tiny room above the store, and every day she felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The white families saw her brown skin and dark eyes and heard the Spanish accent that sometimes crept into her English when she was tired or upset. They called her a Mexican and treated her like she was less than human. The Mexican families, few as they were in Gonzales, saw her light skin and English surname and called her a traitor to her mother's people, someone who thought she was better than them. Marianne finally rose from behind the counter, brushing glass from her dark hair and checking herself for injuries. Her hands were scraped but not seriously hurt, and her dress had suffered nothing worse than some dust. She looked at the broken window and felt tears prick at her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Mr. Peterson would dock her wages to pay for the repair, even though the shooting had nothing to do with her work and everything to do with who she was. She began sweeping up the glass with shaking hands, trying to compose herself before any customers arrived. The door opened with a jangle of bells, and Marianne spun around, the broom clutched in her hands like a weapon. A tall man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking most of the morning light. He wore dusty riding clothes and a worn leather vest, with a hat pulled low over his face. As he stepped inside and removed the hat, she saw he was perhaps 25 or 26, with sandy brown hair that needed a cut and striking green eyes that took in the broken window and her defensive posture with a single sweeping glance. "You all right, miss?" His voice was deep and carried the slow drawl of someone who had spent years working under the Texas sun. He moved toward her with an easy grace that suggested confidence without arrogance, and Marianne found herself relaxing slightly despite her instinct to remain guarded around strangers. "I am fine," she said, keeping her voice steady even though her pulse was still racing. "Just some glass to clean up. What can I help you with?" The man looked at the window again, then back at her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "That bullet hole looks fresh." "Someone take a shot at the store." "It is nothing," Marianne said quickly, turning back to her sweeping. "An accident, perhaps. What do you need?" "My name is Xander Kellerman," he said, not moving toward the shelves or giving any indication he was there to shop. "I just rode into town yesterday, hired on at the Davidson Ranch as a wrangler. That was no accident, and we both know it." Marianne stopped sweeping and looked at him directly, trying to judge whether he was someone she could trust or just another person looking for entertainment at her expense. His green eyes were serious, and there was something in his expression that seemed genuine. Still, she had been fooled before by people who pretended kindness only to turn cruel once they knew she would let down her guard. "Mr. Kellerman, I appreciate your concern, but this is my business and mine alone. Now, if you need supplies, I can help you. Otherwise, I have work to do." She kept her tone professional and cool, the same way she spoke to everyone in town. Distance was safer than connection. Xander stood there for a moment longer, then nodded slowly and walked over to the shelves where the dry goods were kept. Marianne continued cleaning up the glass, acutely aware of his presence in the store. He moved quietly for such a large man, and she could feel him watching her even when she was not looking in his direction. After several minutes, he brought some coffee, beans, and tobacco to the counter. "You work here long?" he asked as she tallied his purchase. "Long enough," Marianne replied without elaborating. "Town seems tense," Xander continued, apparently unbothered by her short answers. "Met some of the ranch hands last night at the saloon. Got the feeling there are some hard feelings running through Gonzales." "There are hard feelings everywhere," Marianne said, wrapping his items in brown paper. "That will be $2.15. Xander counted out the money and placed it on the counter, but when Marianne reached for it, his hand covered hers briefly. The touch was warm and sent an unexpected jolt through her arm. She pulled back quickly, looking up at him with wide eyes. "I know what it is like to be treated as less than you are," he said quietly. "My mother was Irish, came over during the famine. My father was a Texas Ranger, but his family never accepted her. She died when I was young, and I spent my childhood being called a Mick and worse by people who thought themselves better than us." Marianne stared at him, surprised by the sudden confession. His green eyes held no pity, only understanding, and she felt something shift in her chest. "I am sorry for your loss," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "And I am sorry for whatever brought someone to shoot at you through that window," Xander replied. He picked up his package and headed for the door, then paused and turned back. "If you need anything at all, the Davidson Ranch is about 5 miles northwest of town. I am just a ranch hand, but I am a good shot and I do not mind standing up for what is right." Before Marianne could respond, he was gone, leaving her standing behind the counter with her heart doing strange things in her chest. She told herself not to think about him, not to let herself hope that someone might actually care about her welfare. Hope was dangerous, and disappointment was a constant companion in her life. She finished cleaning the glass and replaced the broken pane with a board until Mr. Peterson could arrange for a proper repair, then settled in for a long day of work. The following days brought an unusual pattern to Marianne's life. Xander Kellerman appeared at the general store every morning just after opening, always needing some small item that he could easily have purchased in bulk to save himself the trip. He bought nails one day, then a new bandana the next, then a bar of soap, then some twine. Each time he came in, he spoke to her with a quiet respect that she was not accustomed to receiving, asking about her day and telling her small stories about the ranch work. He never pressed her for personal information or made her feel uncomfortable, but his presence was constant and strangely comforting. Marianne found herself looking forward to his visits, though she tried to hide it. She would find excuses to straighten the shelves near the front window around the time she knew he usually arrived. and she caught herself thinking about things he had said during quiet moments in the store. When he told her about breaking a difficult horse, she imagined him in the corral, strong and capable. When he mentioned the sunset view from the western pasture, she wondered what it would be like to see it with him. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Xander arrived at the store looking troubled. His jaw was tight, and there was an anger in his eyes that Marianne had not seen before. He walked directly to the counter where she stood arranging some new bolts of fabric. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "What is wrong?" Marianne asked, immediately concerned. "I was in the saloon last night, and I heard some men talking. They were discussing you, saying ugly things about your heritage and making plans to run you out of town." His hands clenched into fists on the counter. "One of them was the one who shot through your window. He was bragging about it, saying next time he would not miss." Marianne felt the blood drain from her face. She had suspected, of course, but having it confirmed made everything worse. "Which man?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Garrett Morris. He runs cattle on the land south of town. He was drunk and loud, and I wanted to knock his teeth down his throat, but I figured that would just make things worse for you." Xander's green eyes were intense with suppressed fury. "You cannot stay in town, Marianne. It is not safe." She realized this was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice made her stomach flutter despite the fear coursing through her. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I will not be driven away by men like Garrett Morris." "Then let me help protect you," Xander said. "At least let me walk you home at night and check in on you. These men are dangerous and they have been drinking up their courage. I am afraid of what they might do." Marianne wanted to accept his offer immediately, but years of learning not to trust people made her hesitate. "Why do you care?" she asked bluntly. "You do not know me. I am nothing to you." Xander was quiet for a moment, his gaze never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice was low and earnest. "You are not nothing. From the first moment I walked into this store and saw you standing there with glass at your feet and your head held high despite being terrified, I knew you were someone special. You have strength and dignity that most people could never understand. And if I am being completely honest, I think you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." Marianne's breath caught in her throat. Nobody had ever spoken to her that way before. The few men who had shown interest in her had always done so in secret, ashamed to be associated with someone of mixed blood. Xander stood before her in broad daylight, declaring his admiration where anyone could walk in and hear him. "You should not say such things," she whispered. "People will talk. They will make trouble for you." "Let them talk," Xander said with conviction. "I am not afraid of small-minded fools. What I am afraid of is something happening to you because I was too cowardly to stand by your side." Tears welled in Marianne's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will let me help you," Xander urged. "Say you will give me a chance to prove that not everyone in this world will judge you for circumstances beyond your control." "Why?" Marianne asked again, needing to understand. "Why would you risk your job, your reputation, everything for me?" Xander reached across the counter and took her hand in his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Because when I look at you, I do not see someone who belongs to two different worlds and fits in neither. I see someone who brings two worlds together beautifully. Your mother's strength and grace, your father's determination and honor. You are not half of anything, Marianne. You are whole, and you are wonderful." The tears she had been holding back spilled over, running down her cheeks as she gripped his hand tightly. Nobody had ever made her feel like this before, like she was worthy of being cherished rather than merely tolerated. "I am frightened," she admitted in a small voice. "I know," Xander said gently, but you do not have to be frightened alone anymore." From that day forward, Xander became a constant presence in Marianne's life. He walked her home every evening after the store closed, waiting patiently while she locked up and then escorting her to her small room above the building. They would talk during these walks, sharing stories from their childhoods and discussing their dreams for the future. Marianne learned that Xander wanted to save enough money to buy his own small ranch someday. Nothing grand, just enough land to run some cattle and horses and build a simple house. She told him about her parents and the happiness they had shared despite the prejudice they faced, and how she sometimes felt guilty for not being stronger in the face of the hatred directed at her. "You are the strongest person I know," Xander told her one evening as they stood outside her door under a sky full of stars. "Every day you face people who wish you would disappear, and every day you hold your head high and do your work with dignity. That takes more courage than anything I have ever done." The attention from Xander did not go unnoticed in town. Within days, people were talking about the new ranch hand who was courting the half-breed girl from the general store. Mr. Peterson called Marianne into his office and warned her that her association with Xander was causing problems, that customers were complaining and threatening to take their business elsewhere. Marianne listened to his concerns with a sinking heart, knowing that she could not afford to lose her job. That evening, she tried to tell Xander that he should stop coming around, that his attention was going to cost her everything. They were standing in the alley behind the store, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and she could barely force the words out through the tightness in her throat. "I cannot ask you to sacrifice your livelihood for me," Xander said before she could finish. "But I am not going to abandon you either. Let me talk to Mr. Peterson, see if I can smooth things over." "What could you possibly say to him?" Marianne asked hopelessly. "I will think of something," Xander promised. "Trust me." The next morning, Xander arrived at the store before opening and spent 20 minutes talking to Mr. Peterson in his office. Marianne could not hear what was being said, but when they emerged, Mr. Peterson looked thoughtful rather than angry. He told Marianne to get back to work and said nothing more about Xander's visits. Later, Xander told her that he had offered to do repair work around the store in exchange for Mr. Peterson keeping her employed, essentially working for free on his days off from the ranch. Marianne was overwhelmed by the gesture and tried to refuse, but Xander insisted. "You are worth it," he said simply, and the way he looked at her made her believe him. As spring turned toward summer, their relationship deepened. Xander began teaching Marianne to ride properly, borrowing horses from the Davidson Ranch on Sunday afternoons and taking her out into the countryside beyond Gonzales. These were the happiest hours of Marianne's week, flying across the open grassland with the wind in her hair and Xander riding beside her, laughing at her improving skills. He showed her the western pasture he had mentioned weeks ago, and they sat together on a hilltop watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of glory. "I wish we could stay here forever," Marianne said softly, her shoulder touching his as they sat side by side on the warm grass. "Maybe someday we can," Xander replied. He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. "Marianne, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" She could feel her heart beginning to race. "I am in love with you," Xander said plainly. "I think I have been since that first day in the store. I know our situation is complicated, and I know there are people who will never accept us together, but I do not care about any of that. I care about you. I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Marianne felt like she was floating, suspended in a moment of perfect joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to say it, afraid to let myself feel it, but I do. I love you, Xander." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Marianne did not want to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. She had been kissed before, fumbling attempts by boys who wanted to boast about being with the mixed-blood girl, but this was nothing like those experiences. This was tender and respectful and filled with genuine emotion. When they finally broke apart, Marianne was trembling, and Xander's hand cupped her cheek with infinite care. "I will take care of you," he said. "I swear it." "And I will take care of you," Marianne replied, covering his hand with her own. Their happiness was not meant to last undisturbed. 2 weeks after their declaration of love, Garrett Morris and 3 of his friends cornered Marianne in the alley behind the store just after closing. Xander had been delayed at the ranch and was not there to walk her home, and she had decided to risk the short trip alone rather than wait inside the dark building. It was a decision she regretted the moment she saw the 4 men blocking her path. "Well, well," Garrett drawled, his words slurred from whiskey. "If it is not the little half-breed, where is your Irish dog tonight?" Marianne tried to back away, but one of the other men moved behind her, cutting off her escape. Fear flooded through her, cold and sharp. "Leave me alone," she said, trying to sound brave even though her voice shook. "We have been patient with you," Garrett continued, moving closer. "Gave you plenty of chances to leave town on your own, but you did not take the hint, and now you have gone and contaminated one of our own. That Kellerman boy does not know any better, but we are going to teach you a lesson. Touch her and you will regret it." Xander's voice rang out from the mouth of the alley, and Marianne nearly sobbed with relief. He strode toward them with purpose, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. He was not wearing his usual easy expression. Instead, his face was hard as stone, and there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "This does not concern you, Kellerman," Garrett said, though he took a step back from Marianne. "Anything involving Marianne concerns me," Xander said flatly. "You boys need to move along before someone gets hurt. There are 4 of us and one of you," one of the other men pointed out. Xander's smile was cold and humorless. "I like those odds. Means I will not run out of targets." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension in the alley was thick enough to choke on, and Marianne held her breath, terrified that violence was about to erupt. Then Garrett spat in the dirt and jerked his head at his companions. "This is not over," he said to Marianne. "You and your Irish mongrel better watch your backs." The 4 men pushed past Xander and disappeared into the gathering dusk. As soon as they were gone, Marianne's knees gave out, and she would have fallen if Xander had not caught her. He held her close, one arm around her waist and the other stroking her hair as she shook against his chest. "I have got you," he murmured. "You are safe." "They are going to keep coming after us," Marianne said through her tears. "They will not stop until one of us is dead or we leave town." "Then maybe we should leave town," Xander said seriously. "I have some money saved up. Not much, but enough to get us started somewhere else. Somewhere people do not know us and will not care about your heritage or my mother's birthplace." Marianne pulled back to look at him. "You would do that? Leave your job, leave everything you know?" "In a heartbeat," Xander said without hesitation. "You are more important to me than any job or any town. If Gonzales cannot see how lucky it is to have you, then Gonzales does not deserve us. But where would we go?" Marianne asked, her practical nature asserting itself even through the fear and emotion. "I have been thinking about that," Xander said. "There is land opening up in Montana Territory, good ranch land. The winters are harsh, but the soil is rich and there is plenty of water. We could file a claim, build something of our own where nobody knows our history and nobody cares about anything except whether we are good neighbors." "Montana Territory," Marianne repeated, trying to imagine it. She had never been more than 20 miles from Gonzales in her entire life. The idea of traveling over 1,000 miles to an untamed territory was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Think about it," Xander urged. "I am not saying we have to decide right now, but I want you to know that you have options. You do not have to stay here and let people like Garrett Morris make you feel small." Over the next several weeks, Marianne did think about it. She thought about it while she worked at the store, while she lay in her small bed at night, while she rode across the countryside with Xander on Sunday afternoons. The idea of leaving terrified her, but the idea of staying terrified her even more. Garrett Morris and his friends had become bolder since the confrontation in the alley, making crude comments whenever they saw her in town, and making sure Xander heard about it. Mr. Peterson was growing more nervous about the situation, and Marianne knew it was only a matter of time before he let her go to protect his business. One Sunday in late July, Xander took her back to the hilltop, overlooking the western pasture. He spread a blanket on the grass and they sat together, sharing bread and cheese he had brought from the ranch. The summer heat was oppressive, but a slight breeze made it bearable, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-baked earth. "I have been doing some research," Xander said as they ate. "There is a wagon train leaving from San Antonio in 3 weeks, headed for Montana Territory. If we sold everything we could not take with us and pooled our money, we could afford to join it. We would have enough left over to buy some basic supplies once we got there and tide us over until I could find work." Marianne's stomach fluttered with nerves. 3 weeks, she said. "That is so soon." "I know," Xander said, "but I am worried about what might happen if we stay much longer. Garrett Morris is drinking more and he is getting angrier. I do not want to wait until he does something we cannot recover from." Marianne knew he was right. The situation in Gonzales was deteriorating, and eventually something terrible was going to happen. She looked out over the rolling grassland, thinking about her parents buried in the small cemetery outside town. They had fought so hard to build a life together in Texas, and she felt like leaving would be abandoning their memory. "What would your parents want for you?" Xander asked gently, as if reading her thoughts. "Would they want you to be happy and safe, or would they want you to stay here and suffer out of obligation to their graves?" "They would want me to be happy," Marianne admitted. "My mother always said that home is not a place, it is the people you love. She left her entire family in Mexico to be with my father because she believed their love was worth any sacrifice." "And your father must have loved her very much to marry her despite knowing the prejudice they would face," Xander added. "They made the brave choice. Maybe it is time for us to do the same." Marianne turned to face him fully, taking both of his hands in hers. "If I agree to go with you to Montana Territory, I need you to understand what you are taking on. This will not be easy. There will always be people who judge us, who think we should not be together. You could find someone else, someone whose life is simpler, someone who would not bring you trouble." "I do not want simple," Xander said firmly. "I want you. I want your strength and your courage and your beautiful heart. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to build a ranch with you and raise children with you and grow old with you. None of that will be simple, but it will be real and it will be worth everything." Tears streamed down Marianne's cheeks, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will go with you to Montana Territory. I will build a life with you, wherever that life takes us." Xander pulled her close and kissed her deeply, and Marianne felt like she was finally home, despite sitting in the middle of an open field hundreds of yards from the nearest building. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. "We should get married before we leave," Xander said. "I want to do this properly. I want everyone to know that you are my wife and I am your husband." There is not a preacher in Gonzales who would marry us, Marianne pointed out. Then we will go to San Antonio early and find one there, Xander replied. A big city will have someone willing to perform the ceremony, and we will be legally married before we join the wagon train. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Marianne gave her notice to Mr. Peterson, who seemed more relieved than sorry to see her go. She sold what few possessions she had that were worth anything and packed the rest into 2 small trunks. Xander did the same, settling his affairs at the Davidson Ranch and purchasing supplies for the journey. They told almost nobody about their plans, wary of Garrett Morris catching wind of their departure and trying to stop them. On their last night in Gonzales, Xander insisted on taking Marianne to the saloon for dinner. She protested, knowing they would not be welcome, but he was adamant. "I am not going to let you leave this town thinking you need to hide in the shadows," he said. "We are going to walk in there with our heads held high, have a meal and walk out again. Let them see that they could not break you." It was one of the hardest things Marianne had ever done, walking through the doors of that saloon on Xander's arm. Conversation stopped as heads turned to stare at them. Garrett Morris was there with his usual group of friends, and the hatred in his eyes was palpable. But Xander led her to a table near the window, pulled out her chair like she was a grand lady, and sat down across from her with a smile. "What would you like to eat?" he asked, as if they were the only 2 people in the room. Marianne's hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them in her lap, but she matched his calm tone. "Whatever you are having." They ordered steak and potatoes, and when the food arrived, they ate slowly, talking quietly about their plans for Montana Territory. People continued to stare, and Marianne heard muttered comments from nearby tables, but nobody approached them. When they finished eating, Xander paid the bill and offered Marianne his arm again. As they walked toward the door, Garrett Morris stood up, blocking their path. "Leaving town, I hear," he said. "That is right," Xander replied evenly. "We are headed for better opportunities." "Good riddance to bad rubbish," Garrett sneered. "Maybe now Gonzales can go back to being a decent town." Xander's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice controlled. "Maybe Gonzales will always be a small-minded town full of small-minded people. Either way, it is not our problem anymore." He moved to step around Garrett, but the other man grabbed Marianne's arm. "You think you are better than us, don't you?" he hissed at her. "You and your dirty Mexican blood." Xander's fist caught Garrett square in the jaw before Marianne could even register what was happening. Garrett went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip, and Xander stood over him with his fist still clenched. "Do not ever touch her again," Xander said, his voice deadly quiet. "Do not speak to her, do not look at her, do not even think about her. If I ever hear that you have bothered her or anyone like her, I will come back here and finish what I just started. Are we clear?" Garrett glared up at him but said nothing, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. Xander took Marianne's arm again, more gently this time, and they walked out of the saloon into the cool evening air. As soon as they were outside, Marianne started laughing, half from relief and half from the absurdity of what had just happened. "Did you really just punch Garrett Morris?" She gasped. "I really did," Xander confirmed, flexing his hand. "And I have wanted to do that since the first time I heard him talking about you. It felt good." "You are insane," Marianne said, but she was smiling as she said it. "About you, definitely," Xander agreed, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. They left Gonzales before dawn the next morning, riding horses loaded with their few possessions. Neither of them looked back at the town as it disappeared behind them in the pre-dawn darkness. The journey to San Antonio took 3 days, and they arrived dusty and tired but in good spirits. The city was much larger than Gonzales, bustling with people from all walks of life. Marianne felt some of the tension she had been carrying for years ease as she realized that nobody here paid any attention to her or Xander. They found a small boarding house run by a kindly older woman who charged reasonable rates and did not ask intrusive questions. After cleaning up and resting for a few hours, they set out to find someone who would marry them. The first 3 churches they visited turned them away once the preachers learned of Marianne's mixed heritage. But the 4th, a small Catholic church near the river, had a young priest who listened to their story with compassion. "Love is a gift from God," Father Miguel said in slightly accented English. "Who am I to turn away 2 people who wish to sanctify their love in the eyes of the Lord? Come back tomorrow morning, and I will perform the ceremony." That night, Marianne lay awake in her narrow bed at the boarding house, thinking about what the next day would bring. She had never imagined she would get married, had convinced herself that she was destined to live her life alone because of her mixed blood. Now she was hours away from becoming Xander Kellerman's wife, and the joy she felt was almost overwhelming. The wedding ceremony the next morning was simple but beautiful. Father Miguel's church was small and plainly decorated, but morning light streamed through the windows and lit the space with a golden glow. Marianne wore the best dress she owned, a simple blue cotton that brought out the darkness of her eyes, and Xander had borrowed a proper suit from the boarding house owner's late husband. They stood before Father Miguel and exchanged vows in voices that shook with emotion. "I, Xander William Kellerman, take you, Marianne Isabel Hollis, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Xander said, his green eyes locked on hers. "I promise to love you and honor you all the days of my life, to stand by your side in times of joy and sorrow, to protect you and cherish you until death parts us." "I, Marianne Isabel Hollis, take you, Xander William Kellerman, to be my lawfully wedded husband," Marianne replied, tears streaming down her face. "I promise to love you and honor you all the days of my life, to stand by your side in times of joy and sorrow, to support you and believe in you until death parts us." Father Miguel blessed them and pronounced them husband and wife, and when Xander kissed her, Marianne felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They signed the marriage certificate with the boarding house owner and Father Miguel as witnesses, making their union legal and binding. As they walked out of the church into the bright Texas morning, Marianne was no longer Marianne Hollis, the half-breed girl that nobody wanted. She was Marianne Kellerman, beloved wife of a good man, and she felt like she could face anything. The wagon train left San Antonio 5 days later, a collection of 30 wagons carrying families and individuals, all seeking new opportunities in Montana territory. The journey would take approximately 4 months, traveling through Texas, across Indian Territory, through Kansas, and finally into Montana. It would be dangerous and difficult, but Marianne and Xander faced it together with optimism. The first few weeks on the trail were an adjustment. Marianne had never spent so much time outdoors, and her hands blistered from helping to drive their wagon during Xander's rest periods. They had purchased a sturdy covered wagon and 2 oxen, along with enough supplies to last the journey with careful rationing. At night, they would make camp alongside the other travelers, and Marianne would prepare simple meals over an open fire while Xander tended to the animals. Their fellow travelers were a mixed group. Some were friendly and welcoming, curious about the young couple and their plans for Montana. Others were more reserved, clearly noting Marianne's mixed heritage but choosing to say nothing. A few were openly hostile, making comments within earshot and refusing to associate with them. Marianne found that the hostility bothered her less than it had in Gonzales. These people were strangers, not neighbors she had known her entire life, and their opinions felt less important somehow. One family in particular became their friends during the journey. The Harrisons were traveling with their 3 young children, heading to Montana, where Mr. Harrison's brother had established a successful ranch. Mrs. Harrison was a cheerful woman with a kind heart, and she took an immediate liking to Marianne. She taught her tips for making the trail journey easier and shared recipes that could be cooked over a campfire. The children adored Xander, who would carve small animals from scraps of wood for them in the evenings. "You two will make wonderful parents someday, Mrs. Harrison said one evening as they watched Xander playing with the youngest Harrison child, a boy of about 4. Marianne felt herself blushing. She and Xander had discussed children, of course, but it still felt too new and fragile to think seriously about. "Perhaps," she said, "if we are lucky enough." "Oh, you will be," Mrs. Harrison said confidently. "I can see how much you love each other. That is the most important foundation for a family." The journey was not without its dangers and difficulties. They crossed rivers swollen with spring runoff, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and endured days of rain that turned the trail into a muddy morass. Marianne learned to shoot a rifle when Xander insisted she needed to know how to protect herself, and she became quite good at it, much to his pride. They saw their first buffalo herd in Kansas, a sea of dark bodies stretching to the horizon, and Marianne was awed by the majesty of the creatures. In Indian Territory, they had several peaceful encounters with native tribes who came to trade with the wagon train. Marianne was fascinated by their way of life and the beauty of their crafts. She traded some of her sewing supplies for a beautifully beaded leather bag, and the native woman who made the trade smiled at her warmly. In that moment, Marianne felt a connection to her mother's heritage, a reminder that mixed blood was not a curse, but a bridge between cultures. One night, about 3 months into the journey, Marianne woke suddenly in their wagon to the sound of shouting. She and Xander scrambled outside to find chaos. A group of men had tried to steal some of the horses from the remuda, and a fight had broken out. Xander joined the other men in defending their animals, and Marianne stood by with her rifle, ready to help if needed. The thieves were driven off with a few shots fired into the air, and nobody was seriously hurt, but the incident left everyone shaken. "This is why we travel in a group," the wagon master said the next morning. "Alone, we would be easy prey for bandits and worse. Together, we are strong." As they moved further north, the landscape changed dramatically. The flat prairies of Texas gave way to rolling hills, then to dramatic mountain ranges that took Marianne's breath away. The air grew cooler and crisper, especially at night, and she was grateful for the warm blankets they had purchased in San Antonio. Xander would hold her close as they slept, his body heat keeping her comfortable even on the coldest nights. They reached Montana Territory in late October, just as winter was beginning to threaten. The wagon train disbanded at Fort Benton, with families heading off in different directions to claim their land and start their new lives. The Harrisons were headed west to join Mr. Harrison's brother, and the parting was emotional. Mrs. Harrison hugged Marianne tightly and made her promise to stay in touch. "You are going to do wonderful things," she said. "I just know it." Xander had been researching potential land claims throughout the journey, talking to other travelers and soldiers at the forts they passed. He had his eye on a valley about 40 miles south of Fort Benton, near a small settlement that was just beginning to form. They purchased additional supplies in Fort Benton, including 2 horses to replace the oxen, which were not as well suited to ranch work, and set out for their new home. The valley was even more beautiful than Xander had described. A clear river ran through the center, flanked by meadows that would be perfect for grazing cattle. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with snow. Stands of pine trees provided timber for building, and the whole area felt untouched and full of possibility. "What do you think?" Xander asked, his arm around Marianne's waist as they surveyed the land. "I think it is perfect," Marianne said honestly. "I think we can build something wonderful here." They filed their land claim in the nearby settlement, which was called Riverside and consisted of little more than a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses. The man who processed their claim was a grizzled former mountain man named Silas who barely glanced at Marianne before stamping their papers. "Welcome to Montana territory," he said. "Land is yours if you can hold it. Build a dwelling and cultivate the land, and in 5 years it will be yours free and clear." The first order of business was building a shelter before the worst of the winter arrived. Xander and Marianne worked from dawn until dusk, felling trees and constructing a small log cabin. It was hard work, harder than anything Marianne had ever done, but she threw herself into it with determination. Xander taught her how to notch the logs so they would fit together properly, and she learned quickly. Within 3 weeks, they had a basic one-room structure with a sturdy roof and a fireplace for heat and cooking. Their first night in the cabin was cold but cozy. They had not yet built proper beds or furniture, but they spread their blankets on the floor near the fire and lay together, exhausted but happy. Xander pulled Marianne close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." "We did," Xander agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And this is just the beginning. Next spring we will clear more land and plant crops. I will find work in Riverside over the winter to earn money for cattle. In a few years, we will have a real ranch, maybe hire some hands, expand the cabin. A family," Marianne added quietly. "Maybe we will have a family." Xander's arms tightened around her. "I would love nothing more than to have children with you, but there is no rush. We have time to build our life first, make sure we are stable." "I know," Marianne said, "but I think about it sometimes. What they would look like, whether they would have your green eyes or my dark ones." "They will be beautiful no matter what," Xander said, "because they will be part of you." That winter was harsh, with heavy snows and temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Xander found work with a rancher about 10 miles away, helping to care for cattle through the winter months. He would leave before dawn and return after dark, exhausted but determined to earn the money they needed. Marianne stayed at the cabin, keeping the fire going and working on improving their living space. She built simple furniture from scrap wood, sewed curtains for the single window, and kept their small home as comfortable as possible. The isolation was sometimes difficult after the constant company of the wagon train, but Marianne found she enjoyed the peace. She could be herself here, without worrying about judgment or whispers. When Xander came home each night, she would have a hot meal waiting, and they would sit together by the fire talking about their day. These quiet domestic moments felt like everything she had ever wanted but never dared to hope for. In early spring, just as the snows were beginning to melt, Marianne realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the 3rd time, she knew for certain. That evening, when Xander came home from work, she met him at the door with tears in her eyes. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, alarmed. "Nothing is wrong," Marianne said, laughing through her tears. "Everything is right. Xander, I am going to have a baby." The look on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Pure joy, wonder, and love all mixed together. He picked her up and spun her around, then set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of awe. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Marianne asked, though his reaction had already answered the question. "Happy." Xander cupped her face in his hands. "I am the happiest man alive. You have given me everything, Marianne. A home, a purpose, and now a child. I love you more than words can express." They held each other in the doorway of their cabin as the spring sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Marianne felt a contentment so deep, it was almost painful. Everything they had endured, all the prejudice and hatred and fear, had led them to this moment. She was carrying Xander's child in a home they had built with their own hands on land that belonged to them. She was free in a way she had never been in Gonzales, free to love and be loved without shame or apology. The pregnancy was not easy. Marianne suffered from severe morning sickness for the first few months, and the rough living conditions made everything more difficult. But Xander was attentive and caring, doing everything he could to make her comfortable. He took over all the heavy work around the property and insisted she rest as much as possible. They made the journey to Riverside once a month to stock up on supplies, and so the settlement's doctor, a kindly man named Dr. Foster, could check on Marianne's condition. Dr. Foster was pleased with her progress. "You are healthy and strong," he told her during one visit. "The baby should arrive in early November if my calculations are correct. Do you want me to come out to your place when the time comes, or will you come into town?" "I would prefer if you came to us," Xander said before Marianne could answer. "I do not want her traveling that far when she is in labor." Dr. Foster agreed, and they made arrangements for him to stay with them for a few days around the expected due date. As summer arrived, Marianne's belly grew round and pronounced. She continued to work around the cabin and property, stubbornly refusing to be treated like an invalid despite Xander's protests. She tended the vegetable garden they had planted, cooked their meals, and even helped with some of the lighter ranch work. Xander had purchased 6 head of cattle in the spring with his winter earnings, and he spent most of his time building fences and shelters for them. The small herd was the beginning of their ranch, and both of them felt proud every time they looked at the animals grazing in their meadow. They talked about the future constantly, planning for the years to come and the life they wanted to build for their growing family. In September, a family moved onto the land adjacent to theirs. The Martins were originally from Ohio and had 3 teenage children. They came to introduce themselves one Sunday afternoon, and Marianne was delighted to have neighbors. Mrs. Martin was a practical woman who had helped deliver several babies back in Ohio, and she offered to assist Dr. Foster when Marianne's time came. "It helps to have another woman there," she said. "Men, even doctors, do not always understand what a laboring mother needs." As October turned toward November, Marianne grew increasingly uncomfortable and anxious. She was large and awkward, and the baby seemed to press on every internal organ she possessed. She could not sleep well, could not find a comfortable position, and was generally miserable. Xander did his best to help, rubbing her back and feet, fetching her anything she needed, and reassuring her that everything would be fine. The baby decided to arrive on November 3rd, 3 days before Dr. Foster had planned to come stay with them. Marianne woke in the middle of the night with sharp pains in her lower back and knew immediately what was happening. She woke Xander, trying not to panic. "The baby is coming," she said. Xander was on his feet instantly, pulling on his clothes. "I will ride to get Dr. Foster and Mrs. Martin," he said. "Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" "I have to be," Marianne said, gritting her teeth through another contraction. "Go quickly." Xander rode harder than he ever had in his life, reaching Riverside in record time. He pounded on Dr. Foster's door until the man appeared in his nightshirt, bleary-eyed but alert once he understood the situation. They collected Mrs. Martin and her daughter Sarah, who was 16 and wanted to learn midwifery, and the group made the return journey as quickly as possible. They found Marianne pacing the cabin floor, her face pale but determined. Mrs. Martin took charge immediately, sending the men outside except for Dr. Foster, who set up his medical supplies. The labor lasted throughout the day and into the evening, long and difficult and exhausting. Xander waited outside in an agony of worry, unable to do anything but pace and pray. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby. He rushed to the door but did not enter, waiting for permission. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Martin opened the door with a huge smile. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy boy, and your wife is doing well. Come meet your son." Xander entered the cabin on shaking legs. Marianne was propped up in their bed, looking exhausted but radiant, with a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket in her arms. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Come see him," she whispered. Xander knelt beside the bed and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and his eyes squeezed shut. As Xander watched, the baby yawned and opened his eyes briefly, revealing a deep blue color that would likely change to green or brown in the coming weeks. "He is perfect," Xander breathed. "Absolutely perfect. We need a name," Marianne said. "I was thinking about Thomas James Kellerman." "What do you think?" "I think it is a fine name," Xander said, carefully reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his larger finger instinctively, and Xander felt his heart swell with a love so fierce it was almost frightening. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, son." Dr. Foster examined both mother and baby thoroughly and pronounced them healthy. He and Mrs. Martin stayed the night to make sure there were no complications, then departed the next morning with Xander's profuse thanks and payment. Sarah had been an attentive student throughout, and she promised to check in on Marianne regularly. The first few weeks with a newborn were challenging. Thomas was a good baby overall, but he needed to eat frequently and did not sleep for more than a few hours at a stretch. Marianne was exhausted, still recovering from the birth while caring for a demanding infant. Xander helped as much as he could, changing Thomas's cloth diapers and walking him around the cabin when he was fussy. He had hired a neighbor boy to handle the daily ranch work so he could stay close to home and support Marianne. As Thomas grew, so did their love for him and for each other. Watching Xander with their son, seeing the gentleness with which he cradled the baby and the wonder in his eyes, made Marianne fall in love with him all over again. And seeing Marianne nurse their child, singing softly to him in a mixture of English and Spanish, made Xander grateful every day that he had walked into that general store in Gonzales and met the most remarkable woman he would ever know. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, he was a healthy, happy baby with his mother's dark hair and eyes that had settled into a hazel color somewhere between Xander's green and Marianne's brown. He was curious about everything, always reaching for things and making little babbling sounds. The Martins had become close friends, and their daughter Sarah would often come over to play with Thomas while Marianne got some work done. One spring afternoon, when Thomas was about 8 months old, Marianne and Xander were working in the garden while the baby played on a blanket nearby. Xander paused in his digging to watch his wife and son, and Marianne caught him staring. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I am thinking about how different our lives are now compared to 2 years ago," Xander said. "Back in Gonzales, I was just a ranch hand with no real prospects and no family. You were alone and frightened, dealing with hatred every day. Now look at us. We own our own land, we have a beautiful son, and we are building something real and lasting." Marianne set down her trowel and came to sit beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I could be this happy," she admitted. "In Gonzales, I believed I would live my whole life alone, that nobody would ever love me for who I am. You proved me wrong, Xander. You saw me when nobody else would, and you loved me when I could not love myself. You bring two worlds together beautifully," Xander said, repeating the words he had spoken to her so long ago in a different life. "You are not half of anything, Marianne. You are whole, and you are wonderful, and I am so grateful that I get to spend my life with you." Thomas chose that moment to let out a demanding cry, and they both laughed. Marianne scooped him up and settled him on her hip, and Xander put his arm around both of them. They stood there in their garden, surrounded by the land they had claimed and the home they had built, and looked out at the mountains in the distance. As the years passed, their ranch grew and prospered. Xander's reputation as an honest, hard-working man spread through the region, and he was able to hire 2 ranch hands to help with the expanding herd. They built a larger house to replace the original cabin, with separate bedrooms and a proper kitchen. Marianne started a small business making leather goods decorated with beadwork she had learned from native traders, and her items became popular in Riverside and surrounding settlements. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic child who loved helping his father with the ranch work. When he was 3 years old, he became a big brother when Marianne gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Rose. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Henry Michael. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, everything Marianne had dreamed of but never expected to have. The family was well respected in Riverside and the surrounding area. There were occasionally people who made comments about Marianne's heritage, but they were few and far between, and their opinions held no power over the Kellerman family. Xander had become known as someone who would not tolerate prejudice or cruelty, and most people learned quickly that insulting his wife was a sure way to make an enemy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xander took Marianne back to the hilltop where they used to watch the sunset during their courtship, leaving the children with Mrs. Martin for the afternoon. They rode out together in comfortable silence, and when they reached the top of the hill, they sat together on the grass just as they had years ago. "You ever regret leaving Texas?" Xander asked. Marianne thought about the question seriously before answering. "I regret that my parents are not here to see what we have built," she said. "I wish they could have known their grandchildren. But do I regret leaving Gonzales? Not for a single moment. That place was slowly killing my spirit, Xander. Coming here, building this life with you, has made me who I was always meant to be." "I think your parents would be proud of you," Xander said. "They fought to be together despite the prejudice they faced, and they raised a daughter who had the courage to do the same. You honor their memory every day by living freely and refusing to let small-minded people define you." They watched the sun set together, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the chimney of their house, where their 3 children were probably helping Mrs. Martin prepare dinner. This was home, not the place they had come from but the life they had created together. As Thomas grew older, he began asking questions about his heritage. Marianne told him stories about his grandmother from Mexico, about the strength and grace she had possessed, and how she had left everything she knew for love. She taught him some Spanish words and phrases, wanting him to understand that his mixed blood was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. Xander supported this completely, often sitting with them during these lessons and learning alongside his son. Emma and Henry were equally curious, and family evenings often included stories about both sides of their heritage. Marianne would tell them about her mother's family in Monterey, while Xander would share what he knew about his Irish mother and her journey to America. The children grew up understanding that they came from multiple cultures, and that this diversity made them richer, not poorer. When Thomas was 15, a group of boys in Riverside made cruel comments about his mixed heritage. Thomas came home with a black eye and bloodied knuckles, having defended his mother's honor with his fists. Marianne was upset that he had been hurt, but Xander took him aside for a long talk about when fighting was necessary and when it was better to walk away. He also made it clear that he was proud of Thomas for standing up for what was right. "Your mother is the strongest person I have ever known," Xander told his son. "She faced hatred and violence in Texas because of who she was, and she never let it break her spirit. You come from good stock, Thomas. Never forget that." Emma grew into a beautiful young woman who inherited her mother's talent for beadwork and leather craft. By the time she was 16, her items were selling as far away as Fort Benton and even Helena. She was courted by several young men in the area, but she had high standards, having seen the deep love and respect her parents shared and refusing to settle for less. Henry was the most scholarly of the three children, with a particular interest in law and justice. He talked about going to university someday, perhaps becoming a lawyer who could help people who faced discrimination and prejudice. Marianne and Xander encouraged this dream, setting aside money to make it possible. On a warm summer day when Thomas was 18, Emma was 16, and Henry was 14, the Kellerman family gathered on the porch of their house to watch a thunderstorm roll across the valley. Lightning flashed in the distance, and the smell of rain was heavy in the air. The children were discussing their plans for the future, their voices excited and hopeful. Marianne sat in her rocking chair, watching her family with a sense of deep contentment. Xander stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, and she reached up to cover it with her own. They had come so far from that general store in Gonzales, where a frightened young woman had swept up broken glass while a kind stranger offered help. They had built something lasting and beautiful, not just a ranch but a family and a legacy. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked softly, leaning down to speak near her ear. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Marianne replied. "How lucky we are. We took a chance on each other when it would have been easier to stay alone and safe. We risked everything for love, and look what it brought us. 3 wonderful children, a successful ranch, and the best 20 years of my life," Xander said. "I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." The rain began to fall, gentle at first and then harder, drumming on the roof and soaking the parched earth. The children cheered and ran out into the yard, dancing in the downpour and laughing like the children they still were despite their growing maturity. Marianne and Xander watched them from the porch, arms around each other, smiling at their joy. That evening, after the storm had passed and the children had gone to bed, Marianne and Xander sat together in front of the fireplace. The nights were still cool in Montana even in summer, and the fire was comforting. They held hands in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of companionship and deep understanding. "You remember what you said to me that first day in the store?" Marianne asked. "When you told me you knew what it was like to be treated as less than you are." "I remember," Xander said. "I meant every word." "You saved me," Marianne said simply. "Not just from Garrett Morris or from Gonzales, but from a life of loneliness and fear. You gave me permission to be whole, to embrace all of who I am instead of apologizing for it. Our children will never have to hide their heritage or feel ashamed of where they come from, and that is because of you." "It is because of both of us," Xander corrected gently. You had the courage to leave everything you knew and start over in an unknown place. You built this ranch alongside me, raised our children with wisdom and love, and created a home that is filled with warmth and acceptance. I may have offered you my hand, but you took it and made something beautiful from it." They sat together until the fire burned low, talking about their memories and their hopes for the future. They discussed Thomas's plans to expand the ranch, Emma's growing business, and Henry's dreams of university. They talked about growing old together on this land they had claimed, watching their children have children of their own, and building a legacy that would last generations. As the years continued to pass, that vision became reality. Thomas married a sweet young woman from Riverside named Catherine, and they built a house on the northern section of the Kellerman land. Their first child, a son named Xander after his grandfather, was born when Thomas was 22. Marianne held her first grandchild and cried tears of joy, thinking about how far their family had come. Emma married at 20, choosing a young blacksmith from Fort Benton named David, who loved her fierce independence and respected her work. They moved to Fort Benton, where David had his shop, and Emma opened a store selling her leather goods and other items made by local craftspeople. She had inherited her mother's business sense along with her artistic talent. Henry did go to university, studying law in Helena and graduating with honors. He returned to the area and set up a practice in Riverside, which had grown into a proper town by then. He became known for taking cases that other lawyers would not touch, defending people who faced discrimination and fighting for justice. Marianne was immensely proud of him, seeing in him the culmination of everything she and Xander had tried to teach their children about standing up for what was right. On Marianne and Xander's 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. All 3 children were there with their spouses, and Thomas brought his 2 young sons. The house was full of laughter and love, multiple generations of Kellermans coming together to celebrate the couple who had started it all. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Marianne and Xander took one last walk around the property. They walked hand in hand through the moonlit darkness, visiting all the places that held special meaning for them. The original cabin where they had spent their first winter and where Thomas had been born. The expanded barn where their growing herd of cattle sheltered. The garden where they had worked together countless times over the years. The creek where their children had learned to fish. Finally, they climbed the small hill behind the house and looked back at everything they had built. The main house was dark except for a single lamp in the window that Marianne always left burning. The barn and outbuildings were solid and well maintained. Fences crisscrossed the property, enclosing meadows where their cattle grazed. Mountains rose in the distance, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to everything the Kellerman family had accomplished. 25 years, Marianne said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we left Gonzales, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. The best 25 years I could have imagined, Xander said, and hopefully we have many more ahead of us. I love you, Marianne said, turning to face him in the moonlight. I have loved you since that day you walked into the general store and looked at me like I mattered. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Xander replied, pulling her close. You are my heart, Marianne. Everything good in my life flows from you. They stood together on that hill, 2 people who had refused to let the prejudice and hatred of others define their lives. They had taken a chance on love when it would have been safer to stay separate, and that choice had given them everything that mattered. A family, a home, a legacy of courage and acceptance that would continue through their children and grandchildren. The years continued to be kind to them. The ranch prospered, growing to become one of the most successful operations in the region. Xander's reputation as a fair and honest rancher meant he always had good workers willing to sign on, and Marianne's business continued to thrive. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with young voices and energy during family gatherings. When Marianne was in her 50s, she began writing down the story of her life and her journey with Xander. She wanted her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to understand what she and Xander had overcome to build their family. She wrote about growing up in Gonzales, about the prejudice and hatred she faced, about meeting Xander and falling in love. She wrote about the wagon train journey to Montana and the early struggles of establishing the ranch. She wrote about her parents and their courage in loving each other, despite the world's disapproval. The memoir became a treasured family document, passed down through generations of Kellermans as a reminder of where they came from and what their ancestors had endured. It inspired future generations to stand up against injustice and to judge people by their character rather than their heritage. Xander and Marianne grew old together on their Montana ranch, never losing the love and respect that had drawn them together in that general store so many years ago. Even as their hair turned gray and their steps slowed, they remained devoted to each other. Xander would still bring Marianne wildflowers from the meadow, and she would still greet him with a smile that made him feel like a young man again. They lived to see their children all well established in their lives, to hold numerous grandchildren, and even to meet a few great-grandchildren. The ranch that had started with 6 head of cattle and a one-room cabin had grown into a thriving operation spanning hundreds of acres, providing employment for dozens of people, and serving as a cornerstone of the local economy. On a peaceful autumn evening when Marianne was 68 and Xander was 71, they sat together on the porch swing they had installed years ago. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and the air was crisp with the promise of the coming winter. They rocked slowly, hands clasped, watching their world settle into evening. "You have any regrets?" Marianne asked, a question she had posed several times over the years. "Not a single one," Xander replied, as he always did, "except perhaps that we do not have more years ahead of us. I would like to keep doing this forever." "We have had a good life," Marianne said contentedly. "A full life. We loved each other, raised good children, and built something that will last long after we are gone. Not everyone can say that." "No," Xander agreed. "We are blessed." They sat together until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing, simply enjoying each other's company as they had for over 40 years. The house behind them was quiet, their children grown and living their own lives, but it was not empty. The walls held decades of memories. The land bore the mark of their hard work and dedication, and the family name they had built together would continue for generations. Xander Kellerman lived to be 79 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep with Marianne by his side. She held his hand as he drew his last breath, and though her heart broke, she also felt grateful for the long and happy life they had shared. He was buried on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Beloved husband, father, and grandfather." Marianne lived another 8 years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone. She continued to work on her memoir, adding chapters about their later years and the joy of watching their family grow. She spent time with each of her grandchildren, making sure they knew the stories of their heritage and understood the importance of love, courage, and acceptance. When Marianne passed away at 86, she was laid to rest beside Xander on that hillside, her headstone matching his. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, a testament to the impact she and Xander had made on their community. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren stood together, united by the legacy of love that Marianne and Xander had created. Thomas, now in his 60s and running the ranch with his own sons, stood at his mother's grave and addressed the crowd. "My parents taught us that love is stronger than hate, that courage is more powerful than fear, and that family is defined not by blood alone but by the bonds we choose to create and nurture. They came from nothing, faced impossible odds, and built something that will endure. We honor them best by living the values they taught us and passing those values to our own children." The Kellerman Ranch continued to thrive for generations, always owned and operated by descendants of Marianne and Xander. The original cabin was preserved as a historical site, and Marianne's memoir was published and became required reading in Montana schools as an example of the pioneer spirit and the struggle against discrimination in the Old West. In the main house, which had been expanded and modernized over the years but retained its essential character, a portrait hung in the place of honor above the fireplace. It showed Marianne and Xander in their 40s, standing together in front of their ranch house with the Montana mountains rising behind them. Marianne's hand rested in the crook of Xander's arm, and they were both smiling at whoever held the camera. The love between them was evident in their expressions, in the way they leaned toward each other, in the contentment that radiated from the photograph. Below the portrait was a brass plaque with an inscription chosen by their grandchildren. It read, "Marianne and Xander Kellerman, who proved that love can overcome any obstacle and that two worlds coming together creates something more beautiful than either alone." And so the story of the half-Mexican girl from Gonzales, Texas, and the cowboy with Irish blood who saw her true worth became family legend, then local history, and finally a small but important part of the story of the American West. It was a reminder that even in the harshest times and most unforgiving places, love and courage could create miracles. That two people who refused to accept the limitations society tried to place on them could build a legacy that would last long after they were gone. That being different, being from two worlds, was not a weakness but a strength that brought richness and depth to life. The ranch still stood. The mountains still rose in the distance, and the river still ran through the valley. But more important than any of that, the love that Marianne and Xander shared continued to echo through their descendants, a gift that kept giving generation after generation. They had taken a chance on each other when it would have been easier and safer to remain alone, and that single act of courage had changed everything, not just for them but for everyone who came after. In the end, their story was simple. Two people met, fell in love, faced the world together, and won. They proved that heritage and background matter less than character and heart, that love is stronger than hatred, and that the courage to be true to yourself and to stand by those you love can overcome any obstacle. They brought two worlds together beautifully, and in doing so, they created a third world that was uniquely their own, a world of acceptance and love and endless possibility.